Everything you've been told about inflation is a lie. Not a small lie, not a misunderstanding, a deliberate, carefully constructed narrative designed to protect the interests of people who aren't you. You've been taught that inflation is a monster, a thief in the night, a disease that must be cured at any cost. Politicians campaign against it. Central bankers dedicate their careers to fighting it. The media treats every uptick like an apocalypse. And when inflation does rise, what happens? Interest rates spike, jobs disappear, mortgages become unaffordable. The cure, we're told, requires pain, your pain, for your own good. But here's what they don't tell you. Inflation has winners and losers, and the people who control the narrative, the wealthy, the creditors, the asset owners, they're the losers. That's why they've convinced you to hate it. The winners? Ordinary people with mortgages, workers with wages, governments with debt, young people with futures. Today, I'm going to make a case that will sound insane. Moderate inflation is actually good, not just tolerable, good. And the war against inflation is in many ways a war against regular people. Let me show you what they don't want you to understand. 1. The inflation story you've been sold. First, let's examine the standard narrative. You've heard it 1,000 times. Inflation erodes purchasing power. Your dollar buys less. Your savings shrink. Prices rise faster than your wages. You get poorer. This story has been repeated so often it feels like natural law. Inflation bad, stability good, end of discussion. But let's think about this carefully. Who has savings that sit in cash? Not most people. Most people have debt, mortgages, car loans, credit cards, student loans. Who suffers when cash loses value? People holding large amounts of cash, creditors waiting to be repaid, bondholders collecting fixed interest payments. The wealthy? The standard inflation story is told from the perspective of people with wealth to protect. It's not your story. Let me tell you a different story. 2. The debtor's best friend. Imagine you bought a house in 2019 for $300,000. You took a 30-year mortgage at 4% interest. Your monthly payment is about $1,430. Now imagine inflation runs at 5% annually for a decade. What happens? Your house is now worth $490,000 in nominal terms. Your salary, assuming it kept pace with inflation, is 63% higher than in 2019. But your mortgage payment? Still, 430. The same number, but now representing a much smaller share of your income. Inflation is systematically destroying your debt while leaving your asset intact. This isn't theory. This is how wealth has been built for generations. The greatest wealth transfer in American history happened between 1945 and 1980. The GI Bill generation bought homes with fixed-rate mortgages. Inflation ran at 4 to 5% for decades. Those mortgages became trivial. Those homes became gold mines. The baby boomers didn't build wealth through superior financial discipline. They rode an inflationary wave that made their debts disappear and their assets soar. And then, once they owned everything, they demanded that inflation be crushed. 3. The Volcker myth. Let me tell you about the most celebrated central banker in American history, Paul Volcker. In 1979, Volcker became chair of the Federal Reserve. Inflation was running at 13%. He raised interest rates to 20%. The economy plunged into severe recession. Unemployment hit 10.8%. Businesses failed by the thousands. And Volcker is a hero. Textbooks praise him, economists worship him. He broke the back of inflation. But let's ask, whose back did he actually break? The Volcker shock devastated workers. Unemployment meant poverty, foreclosures, and family destruction. The industrial Midwest never fully recovered. The communities he crushed remain depressed today. Who benefited? Bondholders, creditors, anyone owed money in fixed terms. When interest rates hit 20%, bonds became incredibly valuable. The wealthy parked money in treasuries and collected massive returns. The working class lost jobs, the owning class collected interest. The Volcker shock was, in economic terms, a massive upward wealth transfer disguised as responsible policy. And it established the template that we follow today. When inflation rises, crush it, whatever the cost to workers. 4. The real theft. The standard line is that inflation is theft. It steals your purchasing power. Let's examine this claim. If inflation is 5% and your wages rise 5%, are you poorer? No. Your purchasing power is unchanged. If inflation is 5% and your wages rise 3%, you're losing 2% per year. That's real. But here's what's interesting. Wages often do keep pace with inflation, at least for workers with bargaining power. During inflationary periods, labor markets tend to be tight. Workers can demand raises, unions gain power. During low inflation periods, workers have less leverage, raises are smaller, real wage growth often stagnates. The data shows this. The 1,960 seconds and 1,970 seconds, the inflationary era, saw substantial real wage growth for working Americans. The period from 1980 to 2020, the price stability era, saw real wages flatline. The war on inflation was, in practice, a war on wage growth. And the theft? The real theft happens differently. When central banks raise rates to crush inflation, asset prices fall. But guess who can buy those assets at the bottom? Not workers who just lost their jobs. The wealthy, with cash reserves, scoop up stocks, bonds, and real estate at discount prices. The inflation cure transfers wealth upward far more reliably than the inflation disease. 5. The debt prison. Let's talk about government debt because this is where the inflation politics get really interesting. The United States has over $34 trillion in federal debt. At current interest rates, servicing this debt costs over $1 trillion annually. It's the fastest growing part of the federal budget. How do you escape this debt trap? Option 1. Raise taxes dramatically. Politically, nearly impossible. Option 2. Cut spending dramatically. Also politically toxic. Option 3. Default. Catastrophic. Option 4. Inflate your way out. Here's how option 4 works. If nominal GDP grows at 6%, 3% real growth, plus 3% inflation, debt to GDP ratio falls even if the absolute debt stays constant. Over time, the debt becomes manageable. This is exactly how the United States escaped its World War II debt. In 1946, federal debt was 106% of GDP. By 1980, it was 32% of GDP. The government didn't pay it off, they inflated it away. The same story played out in Britain, in France, in virtually every country that emerged from war with crushing debt loads. But today, we're told that inflation must be kept at exactly 2%. Any higher is irresponsible. The debt must be serviced at full, real value. Who benefits from this? Bondholders, the people who own the debt, primarily wealthy individuals, pension funds, and foreign governments. Who pays? Taxpayers, through higher interest costs. Citizens, through reduced public services as debt service crowds out other spending. The 2% inflation target is a political choice that prioritizes creditors over the general public. It's not economic law, it's class warfare by other means. 6. The investment imperative. Here's something economists know but rarely emphasize. Moderate inflation forces investment. When cash holds its value perfectly, there's no penalty for sitting on it. The wealthy can accumulate cash, remove it from the economy, and wait indefinitely. When cash loses 3 to 4% of value annually, hoarding is punished. Money must be deployed or it shrinks. This creates pressure to invest in businesses, hire workers, and put capital to productive use. Japan learned this lesson painfully. For 3 decades, Japan fought deflation and near zero inflation. The result? Cash hoarding, zombie companies, stagnant wages, an economy that went from world-beating to also ran. Japanese savers kept money in bank accounts earning nothing because prices weren't rising either. The economy calcified. Moderate inflation is the metabolic rate of a healthy economy. It keeps things moving. It forces decisions. It prevents the accumulation of dead capital. The wealthy hate this because inflation means their pile of money shrinks if they don't do something with it. They must take risks. They must invest. They must engage with the real economy rather than simply collecting rent on what they already own. 7. The wage price spiral myth. When inflation rises, you hear immediate warnings about the wage price spiral. Workers demand raises to match prices. Businesses raise prices to cover wages. The spiral accelerates until hyperinflation destroys everything. This story is designed to make you afraid of asking for a raise. Here's what the data actually shows. Wage price spirals are extremely rare. They require specific conditions, usually involving commodity shocks combined with rigid wage indexation that don't exist in most modern economies. In the United States, there has never been a wage price spiral. Not in the 1,970 seconds. Not in 2022. Wages rose, prices rose, and then both stabilized. No hyperinflation, no economic collapse. The spiral narrative serves a purpose. It convinces workers that their wage demands are dangerous, that asking for more money will destroy the economy, that responsible behavior means accepting real wage cuts during inflationary periods. This is a propaganda win for employers. Workers internalize the idea that they shouldn't demand raises when prices rise. The result? Profits rise with prices while wages lag. The inflation burden falls entirely on workers. 8. The housing question. Let me address an objection you might be forming. What about housing costs? What about young people who can't afford homes because prices keep rising? This is a real problem, but it's not an inflation problem, it's a supply problem. Home prices have risen faster than general inflation for decades. This happened during low inflation periods as well as high inflation periods. The cause isn't monetary policy. It's zoning restrictions, NIMBYism, construction costs, and land use regulations. Crushing inflation won't make housing affordable. It will make mortgages more expensive. The Federal Reserve's rate hikes in 2022 to 2023 didn't lower home prices significantly. They just made buyers pay more interest. The winners of high interest rates aren't first-time home buyers. They're cash buyers who don't need mortgages. The wealthy. Low inflation with high interest rates is the worst combination for housing affordability. Prices stay high because existing owners face no pressure to sell. Mortgages become unaffordable because rates are elevated. Moderate inflation with reasonable interest rates is actually better for housing affordability because it creates more liquidity, forces capital deployment, and eventually increases supply. 9. Who really loses? Let's be honest about who genuinely suffers from inflation. Fixed income retirees on traditional pensions can see purchasing power erode. This is real and serious, but it's a policy choice. Pensions could be indexed to inflation, as Social Security largely is. Creditors and bondholders see the real value of their claims diminish. If you're owed $1 million and inflation runs 5%, you effectively lose $50,000 per year. This is the big one. This is why the wealthy hate inflation. Cash hoarders see their piles shrink. If you have $10 million sitting in a bank account, inflation costs you hundreds of thousands annually. Notice the pattern? The inflation losers are people with significant wealth, particularly wealth held in fixed value claims rather than real assets. The inflation winners are debtors, workers in tight labor markets, asset owners with leverage, and governments with obligations. The narrative that inflation hurts regular people is backwards. Inflation primarily hurts the wealthy. Regular people suffer from the cure, high interest rates, and unemployment, not the disease. 10. The 2% cult. Where did the 2% inflation target come from? Not from careful economic research, not from rigorous analysis of optimal monetary policy. It came from New Zealand in 1990. A single interview where a central banker suggested a 0 to 2% target range, which morphed into a hard 2% target. Other central banks copied it. It became consensus. Now it's treated as natural law. But 2% is arbitrary. There's nothing magical about it. Some economists have argued for 4% targets. This would provide more room for monetary policy during recessions, reduce the real burden of debt, and create more pressure for productive investment. Why don't we have a 4% target? Because the transition would mean accepting higher inflation temporarily, and the political constituencies opposed to inflation are powerful enough to prevent it. The 2% target is a policy choice that benefits creditors at the expense of debtors. It's not science, it's politics. 11. The distributional question. Here's the key insight that changes everything. Inflation and deflation have opposite distributional effects. Inflation transfers wealth from creditors to debtors, from old to young, from those who have to those who owe, from the past to the future. Deflation does the opposite. It transfers wealth from debtors to creditors, from young to old, from those who owe to those who have, from the future to the past. Price stability sounds neutral but isn't. It locks in existing distributions. Those who have, keep. Those who owe, continue owing at full value. Once you understand this, the politics of inflation become clear. The wealthy prefer stability or deflation because they're net creditors. They own assets and hold claims on others. The working and middle class should prefer moderate inflation because they're net debtors. They owe mortgages, student loans, and credit card debt. But the working and middle class have been convinced to advocate against their own interests. The inflation narrative has been so effective that debtors march in the streets demanding that their debts remain maximally burdensome. 12. The historical evidence. Let me give you some history that doesn't fit the narrative. The United States, 1945 to 1980. Inflation averaged around 4%. This was the period of greatest middle class expansion in American history. Wages rose, homeownership expanded, debt burdens fell. The American dream was most achievable when inflation was too high by today's standards. Germany, 1950 to 1970. The economic miracle. Inflation ran 2 to 4%. Growth was spectacular. The middle class flourished. China, 1990 to 2020. Inflation averaged around 5%, the most dramatic poverty reduction in human history. Hundreds of millions lifted to middle class status. Japan, 1990 to 2020. Near zero inflation, 3 lost decades, stagnation, a cautionary tale of what happens when you worship price stability above all else. The United States, 1980 to 2020. Inflation averaged 2 to 3%, wage stagnation for the middle class, exploding inequality. The rich got richer, everyone else treaded water. The correlation isn't perfect, but it's suggestive. The periods celebrated for middle class prosperity were periods of moderate inflation. The period celebrated for price stability was a period of middle class decline. Conclusion. Cui bono? When someone tells you inflation is bad, ask yourself, bad for whom? When central banks raise rates to crush inflation, ask yourself, who benefits from these rate hikes? When politicians promise to fight inflation at any cost, ask yourself, who pays that cost? The war on inflation is not waged on your behalf. It's waged on behalf of creditors, bondholders, and the wealthy. You've been recruited as infantry in a war against your own interests. Moderate inflation, 3 to 4% annually, is not a crisis. It's an economic condition that favors the young over the old, debtors over creditors, the future over the past. The wealthy have every reason to fear it. You don't. I'm not arguing for hyperinflation. I'm not saying 10% or 20% inflation is fine. That brings real problems, real instability, real hardship. But the obsession with 2%, the panic over 4%, the willingness to throw millions out of work to get from 5% to 2%, that's ideology, not economics. That's class interest masquerading as responsible policy. The next time you hear that inflation must be crushed, remember who's doing the crushing and who's getting crushed. It's not the same people. If this made you think about inflation differently, hit that subscribe button. Because understanding whose interests economic narratives serve is the first step to not being manipulated by them. See you in the comments, and remember, economics always has winners and losers. The question is whether you know which one you are.